everybody tuning in. Welcome and warm greetings to everyone today. This is the Financial Inclusion Data Working Group technical webinar. This is the first part out of a two-part series, and today's webinar is titled Revamping Financial Inclusion Demand-Side Surveys. My name is Tati, and I am a policy analyst in the AFI Policy Programs and Regional Initiatives Unit, or PPRI, and I will be supporting today's webinar with my colleague, Luis Trevino, the Senior Policy Manager of Financial Inclusion Data, who will be today's moderator. And without further ado, I would like to call on the Senior Policy Manager for FIDWG, Luis Trevino. And Luis, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Tati. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining today for this webinar. It's part of two webinars. So today is on revamping demand-side surveys. Welcome, and before starting, please let me introduce you to our honored speakers today. So we will have first Mrs. Christine Howard from SEMFRI Insight to Impact. I will brief you on their biographies just to present them appropriately. Christine right now is a technical director at SEMFRI, a financial inclusion think tank based in South Africa. SEMFRI, along with Freeman Trust, hosts the Insight to Impact facility, a global resource center that seeks to improve financial inclusion with the smarter use of data. For the past few years, Christine has been part of I2I measurement team, where she has, amongst others, led the Mexico Financial Needs Pilot Study and drafted Financial Needs Toolkit. Christine, well, I think the majority of you know her. She has been contributing quite a lot with the Financial Inclusion Data Working Group. So I want to welcome Christine. Now I will read all of our speakers, and then we will begin with Christine. Now we also have we're lucky to have Ms. Akata Taito from the Reserve Bank of Fiji, and vice co-chair of the Financial Inclusion Data Working Group. Akata is a senior analyst for financial inclusion and market conduct at the Reserve Bank of Fiji. She has 9 years of experience in the area of financial system development and financial inclusion. Akata played a key role in Fiji's first demand-side survey and the design of the Financial Inclusion Strategic Plan, and is currently the Reserve Bank's lead player in the design of the second demand-side survey. So I want to also welcome Akata. And last but not least, we have Mrs. Maria Musombo Katepa from Bank of Zambia and also a FIDWG member. Maria is a payment system specialist at the Bank of Zambia with over 21 years of central banking experience. At the Bank of Zambia, Mrs. Maria has been instrumental in the development of the framework for collecting disaggregated data, and at the FIDWG has contributed substantially to the development of the supply-side draft guideline framework and templates for collecting supply-side data. Maria has also been a trainer of trainers in macroeconomics at the Financial Management Institute of Eastern and Southern Africa, and a specialist in the principles for financial market infrastructure. So let me welcome Maria also. Thank you so much for joining us today. And before we begin, allow me to share with you the main objectives of this webinar, which is, as I mentioned, the first part of two webinars. So here, today, we want to identify the main contributions and practical uses of financial inclusion demand-side surveys. We want to identify key methods and lessons learned to formulate the overall demand-side surveys methodology and questionnaire in prioritizing the arena of policy needs and objectives. And finally, we want to share the experience. So we will share the experience from Fiji and from Zambia on prioritizing the arena policy needs and objectives in a demand-side surveys, and one will be on measuring the resilience in a climate emergency response, and the other one on assessing the financial health with gender considerations. So, as mentioned, the structure will be as follows. So first, we will give the floor to Christine. She will share us. She will open the stage on this webinar. And after that, I will give the word to Akata, and then Maria will present the case study from Zambia. So, ladies and gentlemen, please let me give the floor to Christine. Christine, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luis. All right, good day, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be with you. We've met quite a few times, quite a number of us, but it's great for me to join this virtual session as well. As Luis said in his introduction, I think the reason that we convened here today is the recognition that financial inclusion measurement is changing. Even a decade ago, financial inclusion and the targets that we set for financial inclusion was in the first instance about measuring access and measuring the number of people or the percentage of the population that has an account. But over the years, I think you would agree with me that the emphasis has shifted to also understanding how people are using those financial services that they have. And very importantly, also, what is the impact of financial inclusion? Financial inclusion is no longer just about counting beans, it's about understanding what difference it makes to people's lives. Now at Insight to Impact, we've been working with the Financial Inclusion Data Working Group over the past couple of years to develop a new approach to financial inclusion measurement that starts from the perspective of people's financial needs. So asking, what are people's actual financial needs? How do they meet those needs? And then importantly, does it lead to good outcomes for the customer? Tati, you can go to the next slide. So a number of you will be familiar with the financial needs measurement framework, but let me just recap it briefly. So as I said, the starting point is financial needs. And we identify 4 quite universal financial needs that everybody faces. You have to transfer value from one person to another, make payments. You have to make balance your income and your expenses in each income cycle, so make ends meet. You have to be able to weather financial shocks. So you have to be resilient in the face of unexpected events that creates a financial impact for you. And everybody wants to pursue opportunities or to strive for goals in life that they need a large pot of funds for. So if you have that as the starting point, the next question is, what do people do to meet those financial needs? So what is the portfolio of financial services or strategies, what we call financial devices, that people use towards meeting their needs? And then finally, are those needs met? So what are the outcomes of the financial service usage? If you can click. So let's look at it in the way that it then manifests in a demand side survey. So everybody experiences specific use cases. You don't have resilience as a need that you experience. You experience the fact that your child is sick and you have to take the child to the hospital. So there are a variety of use cases that people experience that can then be classified under each of these financial needs. The next perspective would then be to say, okay, if the child is sick, if that is the use case, what do you do? What are the different strategies that you employ to meet that use case? Maybe you use some money from under your mattress at home. Maybe you are fortunate enough, like I am, to have medical insurance that you can draw on. Or you go to your relatives or to friends and you ask them to make a contribution. Or you take out maybe a loan from a money lender. All these are different financial devices that together combine into a portfolio of financial services or instruments that you use towards that use case. So we would then explore, how do people use this? How does this differ between different types of financial devices? Finally, then the question would be, are you able to meet that underlying use case or that underlying financial need through this portfolio of financial devices that you use? Are you able to pay those hospital bills or the medicine bills? Are you able to regain your previous financial position in a certain amount of time after this big financial expense has been incurred. So this is the, Tati, you can go on. This is the overall conceptual framework that we developed for how to measure financial needs. But as you know, the proof is in the pudding. So it doesn't matter that it makes sense conceptually to say that we want to understand financial inclusion through this lens. We then wanted to set out to see if we can, in actual fact, measure financial inclusion from this perspective. And that is where we then partnered with the Financial Inclusion Data Working Group. We're still on the previous slide, sorry, Tati. To embark on a range of pilot surveys. We did some pilot surveys in Mexico, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Zimbabwe. We also had questions in the Philippines. We did some further studies. We integrated some questions into FinScope. Then confronted us with the question, how do you integrate this framework, which is set up from a specific perspective, into a demand-side survey of financial inclusion? Next slide. And we found that there are two different ways in which you can apply the financial needs lens. You can either add it to an existing demand-side survey, be it in a different or specific module on financial needs, or just in questions that you integrate into the survey. Or you can set up a dedicated survey that is structured fully around the financial needs framework. In this way, if you can click, we've come to experience for ourselves the challenges of designing a demand-side survey that tries to marry different frameworks or objectives or angles. I think others face the same challenge, and that is the whole reason for today's webinar. Trying to incorporate additional angles into an existing demand-side survey, or else refocusing a demand-side survey to achieve a particular objective. And the question really is then, what should be the organizing principles? What are the implications for your existing indicators if you now change the structure of a demand-side survey? So what I'll do in the rest of my presentation is just to give you some general considerations and lessons based on our experience in our pilot surveys. And then Akata and Maria will speak to how they are incorporating specific angles on the ground in their financial inclusion surveys. Next slide. I'm going to talk you through three very simple, which may even sound like self-evident lessons, but I think nevertheless valuable lessons that we've learned through our pilot studies. The first one is the importance of having a very clear focus. So what we found is that often you want to incorporate this framework, you want to have additional questions, there are lots of different angles that you want to incorporate, but all of this adds a lot of survey length. And it may lead to questions and lots of data that's being generated on the back of it that you end up not necessarily always using in the end. So are you generating superfluous data? And in order to avoid that, spend a lot of time and resources developing data that you will end up not using, it's important to decide upfront what the organizing principle or the core framework will be. And then, and this was very difficult for me, you have to be willing to let some things go. You have to be strategic about the trade-offs. Now, what should be that starting point? I think the first and foremost, the starting point should be your underlying policy objectives. If there is a financial inclusion strategy, obviously that is where you will be starting. You will be led by the financial inclusion strategy and ask, what does the demand-side survey need to cover to speak to the strategy, to be able to measure progress against the strategy? What key indicators do you need to track? Are there any specific policy objectives that are front of mind in the current economic or socio-economic context or climate? And here the Financial Inclusion Data Working Group guideline note on demand-side surveys gives some good tips regarding different policy angles to take into account, general versus specific, macro versus micro, etc. But I think the important lesson is just that there should be a central organizing framework according to which the demand-side survey is designed. Next, it's important to identify key themes, and here the other speakers will speak to how they went about identifying key themes, be it small business development, gender, financial health, climate resilience. But then to ask, what are the handful of key indicators that you would need to track to really understand or get to the heart of that key theme? And how do the different questions nest under this central point of departure? So to return to our financial needs example, we started by asking what use cases people have, and then we asked what financial services they use towards that use case. So the financial service usage was nested within the core framework of needs rather than the other way around. Next slide. Tati, if you can just go to the next slide. I'm still seeing lesson 1 on my screen. If you can just scroll down to the next slide, please.
I think Tati's connection dropped, so let me set up the presentation and share it. Just a moment, please.
Okay.
I have it here.
There you go. There you go. Thank you. Okay. No, previous
okay,
one.
it's okay.
Previous one.
Excellent.
Just one up, Louise.
Oh, it's Tati. I think Tati regained the.
Oh, okay. Tati, just one up. It's lesson 2. No, previous. There you go. There you go. Okay. So the second lesson is, once you've determined your focus, next slide, please, then you should go about deliberately designing and testing the questions to then speak to that focus. If you can, there you go. That's it. And here it's important to take the local context into account. Are there specific terms, terminology, specific concepts that are unique to the local context? How do people refer in this specific country to something like savings group? Are there certain cultural norms and taboos that you need to take into account? So even though in our pilot surveys we look to various other countries for comparative examples, it's always important to come back to the local context when you design your actual survey. The second very important point, and this is a lesson that I personally have learned the hard way, is the importance of cognitive testing of survey questions. So typically you would pilot test the survey questions before you go to field. But cognitive testing is a specific technique where you ask the question, see how people answer it, and then really probe deeply to get to the bottom of how did they understand the question being asked to them, why did they answer in the way that they did, to really get a sense of how should you formulate the questions to get the best possible approaches. And in the Mexico survey that I helped design, the financial needs survey, even though we did pilot test the questions, we didn't do specific cognitive testing. And there was one question where it was clear once the data came in that the people hadn't fully understood the question, and it therefore rendered the answers to that particular question meaningless. So I think cognitive testing of the survey questions is a very important part of the deliberate design of the survey structure to deliver on that focus. And then the third part is the length. So reality checks. Good survey practice actually asks that a demand-side survey should not take more than 30 to 40 minutes to administer, otherwise you start to lose people's interest. And here the CNBV in Mexico that we worked with were really good to give us guidance, because in the National Financial Inclusion Survey, the UNIF, they follow the practice of not having a survey that takes longer than 30 minutes to complete. And that is, again, where you have to be willing to let some things go and be strategic to stick to questions that really render those indicators that can speak to your specific focus. Next slide. There are a number of resources available in terms of how to go about designing effective questions. And I won't necessarily go through all the tips here, because I think that the number of you, all of you are familiar with a number of it. But I think that the art of question writing is about making sure that contents are easily understood. So using simple and clear language to ensure that the interviewers and the respondents understand the questions, that they understand the answers that they're providing, and that they understand each other, that they can have a good rapport. So some of the good practices include to explain important terms first, use one concept per question, to use simple language, as I said, to be very direct, use as few words as possible. When you're asking people to recall quantities, be very specific. Try and keep it recent. A big downside to demand-side surveys is that people suffer from recall bias, so they cannot remember what happened a long time ago. So try and tailor the questions to something that is really within the scope of the respondents to answer, and avoid leading questions and avoid jargon and acronyms. And think about, and this is where the cognitive testing can help, what is the best way to frame a question? For example, we learned that it may be more effective to ask people, have you ever sent money using a cell phone, than to ask them, do you use mobile money? Because we understand what we mean by mobile money, but it might not be so self-evident for other people. Let's go on to the next slide. Then the third lesson, and this is really a parting thought that I want to leave with you at the end of my presentation, and that leads into the second webinar in this series, is a full-length face-to-face demand-side survey still the optimal way to track financial inclusion? Or should you consider also adding complementary data sources? Now, we have found in our pilot studies that demand-side surveys remains important in the quest for financial inclusion and impact, because it allows you to quantitatively track consumer behavior. It allows you to understand the customer's perspective, to understand their full financial life, not just what you can see when tracking transactions on bank accounts, for example. And it allows you to also explore people's perceptions. So I do think that demand-side surveys are still crucial in the quest to understand financial inclusion. But I think it's also important that we must recognize it can simply not be everything to everybody. So the question would then be, in trying to measure financial inclusion to meet your policy objectives, and in reconciling different angles or objectives that you want to inform through your measurement effort, what is the optimal suite of different instruments or methods that you want to apply? What can you use alongside demand-side survey? For example, qualitative demand-side research, in-depth interviews, focus groups, financial diaries, or on the transaction side, looking at data generated by banks or by mobile network operators on digital financial services that can give you more of a real-time and objective perspective on the actual behavior, actual usage of people's financial services. And I think this is particularly relevant when there are specific policy questions that arise that need a quick turnaround. So for example, under the current COVID-19 pandemic and the changed behavior that is forced under that, it might be an important policy objective to understand how are people changing their usage of digital financial services? Or if a government made policy changes to facilitate digital financial services, what is the impact or the effect of that? Then it might not be feasible to wait 2 years until a demand side survey comes online. And the question is, what other techniques can you use to complement and supplement that and be responsive in the face of different and new policy objectives arising? The next speakers will now outline how they go about incorporating these specific policy objectives. And I hope that this background that I gave you was able to just set the scene in terms of understanding the different objectives that come into play and what the organizing principle should be when you think about how to integrate that into a demand side survey. I'm just going to leave you on the last slide with a few key resources. As I mentioned, the FIDWG Financial Inclusion Data Tracking and Measurement Guideline Note provides some good examples from the different Financial Inclusion Data Working Group members. Insight to Impact has also compiled the Demand Side Survey Implementation Guide that gives a lot of practical considerations and tips also on the process. And then lastly, on our financial needs approach, we've published also with AFI a toolkit on how to go about designing and implementing the financial needs approach. And with that, back to you, Louise.
Thank you so much, Christine. Thank you for this presentation. I think you covered the three key points on developing demand-side surveys, to have a clear focus, to understand what are the policy needs, to deliberate design and the testing of the instrument and the methodology that you are developing, because a demand-side surveys implies quite a lot of resources invested, right? And finally, I think it's fundamental to add complementary data sources. I think that's fundamental. And in fact, on the second part of this webinar that will be next week, I think we'll focus on that third aspect. Now, please let me give the floor to Akata Taito. She will present measuring resilience in the context of an emergency in Fiji. Taito, the floor is yours. Thank you. Akata, sorry.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you, Christine. And Bula, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or evening to all of you that have joined us today. I hope everyone is staying safe and sane with this COVID-19 situation. My presentation will focus on measuring resilience in the context of an emergency, and I will be talking to you from Fiji's experience, which is at the very early stages. So if we can go on to the first slide, please. So as you know, climate change has emerged at the forefront of threats to economic development of small island countries, particularly for Fiji being among the vulnerable in the Pacific. And so in recognition of this climate change challenges to our Reserve Bank's vision of leading Fiji to economic success, our journey towards developing the financial sector's response began. And given that Fiji's national strategies on climate change and sustainable development have been clearly documented in a number of strategic plans, the Reserve Bank's effort is to turn our attention to the financial industry, and especially when access to financial services features quite prominently in these strategies and has been linked with enhanced resilience. So in our response to these national efforts, which you can see on the first box, and the financing gap, we have held various workshops. We have strategies that have been put in place, including the Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which has been drafted and looks at the broader sustainable concept, which includes climate change. This roadmap is a complementary plan to our National Financial Inclusion Strategic Plan, although there is no specific monitoring and measurement framework as of yet. Again, the Sustainable Finance Roadmap is still work in progress. So this first slide sort of put to some extent, our current efforts on climate change resilience. And now we'll look at what motivated us to put more focus on climate change resilience, and to include some of the more specific questions on our upcoming demand side survey. If we can move on to the second slide, please. Tati? The next slide, please. Yeah. So the German Watch Global Climate Risk Index in 2017 did a study and ranked Fiji among the top 15 countries worldwide which is most vulnerable to weather-related catastrophes. And as you can see on the slide, in the last decade, Fiji experienced frequent cyclone almost every year with increased intensity. And these natural disasters are projected to become more frequent and severe under moderate and severe climate change scenarios. These natural disasters have had major implications for our capital infrastructure, as well as key economic sectors. And as you can see on the graph, these natural disasters have significantly changed our growth path, further slowing down our economic development. It has also pushed thousands of people further down the poverty line. And from a financial inclusion perspective, more so often when a disaster strikes our or as our current situation, a global pandemic, it is usually the most vulnerable that are most affected. Tati, can you move on to the next slide, please? And these vulnerable usually don't have any means of financial safety net, so they tend to rely on government for assistance in rebuilding livelihoods. And for countries like Fiji with small economies and limited physical space, time and again, we tend to see these vulnerable sectors are directed to use their superannuation savings that is specifically set aside for retirement, and then later on in the future add more burden to government through social welfare payouts. And this is where we feel that financial inclusion can assist, because when we talk about financial inclusion, it is about improving livelihoods through access and use of financial services. And that means we need to ensure that financial services are suitable and that are meeting their needs. But data on information on understanding individuals and households' past coping strategies, and more particularly their needs, are missing. And we need our efforts to be effective and that they are targeted at the right segment. So being able to incorporate questions that will provide us with this key understanding is very, very important for direct and effective policy design. And that is why we decided to sort of fit in questions relating to climate change and how do we measure resilience into our upcoming demand side surveys. The next slide, please. Tati? So our questions are quite simple. First, I can see that the slides are a bit messed up, but I hope that you can bear with me. So our questions are quite simple. First, we try to find out if they have experienced a negative event in the past. Then we inquire about their past coping strategies. And from their past experiences and lessons learned, we want to know whether they use the same coping strategies, if they feel that those strategies are sufficient, or that they would prefer to explore something else. And from there, then we move on to see whether they are aware of financial products and services that they can tap into when a disaster strikes, because these are possible reasons for non-use of financial products and services. Financial instruments can be available, but they are not aware of it, so they are not using it. Then we try to understand if they are willing to spend money, meaning buy insurance policies, investments, or set aside savings to protect themselves. And if so, what are the likely financial products and services that they're willing to take up? If not, we ask for reasons behind it. And finally, we ask whether they feel that financial institutions or government, or even both should come up with a resilience tailored financial product. And that is whether it be fully subsidized by government or partially subsidized or even market driven. So we intend to, so these are our questions. Tati, can you move on to the next slide, please? So we intend to hold focused discussion groups, and because our sample size is for 100 enumeration areas, we're looking at having focus group discussions with 10. Tati? Tati, can we move on to the next slide, please? Louis?
Yes, sorry, I think she had a problem with the connection. Let me share the slide. Now it would be, I don't know if this is okay. I don't know if this is on the screen.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I can, yeah. So we intend to hold focus discussion groups, and because our sample size is for around 100 enumeration areas, we look at having focus group discussions with 10 enumeration areas just to deep dive into this topic and more specifically to understand women's resilience to climate-related events. This is understanding what are the immediate needs when a disaster strikes, what are the barriers or challenges to accessing financial services, to assist them in smoothing their consumption or protecting their properties or assets, as well as the type of financial services that they would prefer to use under such circumstances. Just one last point before I end my presentation, the questions that I had mentioned earlier, similar questions were also asked in our household income and expenditure survey. This is the recent survey which covered disaster as well as any other income shock. And the survey questions captured both negative and positive shocks and how households respond to both. Our household income and expenditure survey covered a sample size of 6,000 households. And interestingly, this survey was conducted pre-COVID-19. So if all goes according to plan, we would be able to get two very important data sets, pre and post-COVID. So it would be really interesting to see the outcome and the different coping strategies that would come out of these results. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agata. I think this was very acknowledging and it brings very useful case study on how to adapt a concrete policy need with a measurement tool as a demand side survey. And as we see, financial inclusion has a very direct impact, right? Can have a direct impact on resilience and be very useful to provide information for decision makers on how to set up this kind of policies. Well, thank you so much, Akata. As I mentioned, we will have a Q&A at the end of the session. So now, please let me give the floor to Ms. Maria Catepa. She will be presenting on measuring financial health going beyond access, usage, and quality. Dear Maria, the floor is yours. Maria?
Am I mute?
No, I think we hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I continue.
Yes, please, Maria, your floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Like I was saying, my presentation is basically building on to the blocks that my two colleagues have basically presented. So the angle for my presentation will be focusing on gender, as well as the complementary questions that will be included in the new demand survey that will be conducted this year, 2020. So the outline is as presented before you, so I'll not go into the outline. Next slide, please. So the overall objective for the demand survey that will be conducted this year, being led by Bank of Zambia, is measuring overall financial inclusion, that is focusing on financial health, access, usage, quality, financial literacy, and most importantly, using the sex variable by the adult population of Zambia, meaning that for every question that will be included in the demand survey, we can use those results to analyze the gender aspect of financial inclusion. Next slide, please. As you are aware, the last demand survey that was conducted in Zambia was as of 2015. And this was a FinScope study that was conducted by FIDWG Zambia. The current one that has been formulated will be spearheaded by Bank of Zambia. But of course, we are carrying along a lot of stakeholders. So in terms of the use of the results, what you see on the screen is basically compilation of the various interests that will be presented in the multi-sectorial team. So there are policy makers such as Bank of Zambia, ZICTA, there are businesses, there are commercial banks, there are fintech groups, there are researchers. So the data that will basically be collected from this demand survey will be used by the various stakeholders. Next slide, please. So where are we coming from in terms of the reality on the ground? Basically, what you see on the screen is that we are able to see that the gender aspect is basically lagging behind the main folk in terms of access, usage of financial services. So in this demand survey that is coming up, there's a strong focus to complement the supply side data with the demand side data in terms of understanding the gender aspects. What are the barriers that are preventing the women folk, the youth, the disabled from participating into the financial services? Next slide, please. So the financial health reality check on the ground, like Christina indicated, there are various complementary data that the Bank of Zambia has been collecting, both from the supply side and from other mean demand surveys conducted by other stakeholders, which has basically brought out the reality on the ground that the gender aspect is still lagging behind, that there is a lot of financial illiteracy among our people, that there are dormant accounts and mobile wallets, and basically from the demand survey that we have designed, we want to understand why this is so. We also want to understand if our people are making any income. Are they engaged in any economic activities? Are they generating income? To be able to even make savings. How are they living their lives or meeting their bills from day to day? Are they meeting those bills through borrowing? Are they planning for the little income that they are earning? Is it because they don't have identity cards? Or is it because of cultural norms that they are not participating in the financial services? So overall, we are trying to look at the preparedness for financial reality and checks. Next slide, please. So in terms of the methodology that has been used, basically the demand survey for 2020 will be a repeat survey and it's to be a sampling survey. So basically look at the indicators that were shown in the FinScope survey of 2015, where we'll be talking about the services that are provided and the various uses of financial services. So in terms of the themes that will be running through the survey, we'll look at the access, we'll look at usage, we'll look at the quality, we'll look at the spending patterns, we'll look at the saving culture, we'll look at how the consumers are managing their debt, and if at all they are planning ahead. So in terms of the indicators, we'll be looking at the overall financial inclusion indicators using a 6 variable. In terms of how we've organized the survey, the Bank of Zambia will take the leadership, but we have a multi-sectorial team of about 13 participants. And these, some of them include the Ministry of Finance Rural Unit, Ministry of Finance Sector Management Unit, United Nations Capital Development Fund, Pensions and Insurance, Securities and Exchange Commission, the Commercial Banks, the Association for Microfinance Institutions. And all these have been brought on board so that we are able to collaborate and ensure that we do not leave out the important indicators that matter to our stakeholders. In terms of the tool, the survey will basically be conducted through a questionnaire that will be administered by interview, and we'll be interviewing both household heads and also individuals. For the sample and granularity, this will cover both national, provincial, rural, urban, gender, age group, location, income, education, position, role played in the household. Next slide, please. So why the importance of financial health? I think it's important that we look at financial health because it's only when people have income can they be engaged in consuming some of the financial services that are offered. So it is critical that in the demand survey, we include questions which will speak to how people are calculating their net worth, or in finding out if at all they even earn an income. How do they plan for their expenses? Do they even eliminate expenses? Do they save for future goals? How do they spend their money? Do they plan for emergencies? So basically, we'll be looking at how they prioritize their spending and savings. Next slide, please. So in terms of the opportunities and advantages of the multi-sectorial team, I think there are a lot of synergies that are being created from this multi-sectorial team, because there'll be a structured consultative process that will ensure the success of the exercise itself. And also it includes important indicators of interest of the various stakeholders. And the big one is the mitigation of financial challenges, because the different stakeholders will bring to the table different resources that will facilitate for the success of the exercise. It also presents a unique capacity to leverage on both public and private sector focused staff, financing instruments, as well as knowledge. Next slide, please. In terms of the challenges, like Christina mentioned, I think there's a danger of overloading the questionnaire, but the multi-sectorial team is very much aware of those shortcomings. So they're trying to ensure that much as all the interest groups would like to be taken on board, they will have to prioritize the questions. And of course, with the administration of the interview itself and the questions that will be designed, you cannot rule out the weakness of the respondents having difficulties in understanding the questions. Next slide, please. And I think this is basically my last slide. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I think I was also muted. Thank you so much, Maria, for this, for your presentation. I think I find it very revealing that you are also included not only the scope with on financial health, that it's a relatively new concept, and that also I think I see a very close complementarity with the financial needs, and also on specifically also on measuring the gender gap. I think it provides a lot of richness, this analysis in that terms. So I think this is also very, 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 very useful. And well, as we have seen, we have this, we have the luck to have these 2 case studies, and also the overall arcing setup from Christine. And I think I would like to open this now for Q&A. I don't know, Tati, if you have access to the Q&A resource, or if
yes, we have one question from the floor. It's from Mr. Amar. How do national statistics institutions contribute to the implementation of the demand side survey?
If one of the speakers want to answer. Yeah.
I can chip in. For the case of Zambia, the Central Statistics Office, which is an equivalent of the organization that has been mentioned, is mandated by law in the country to conduct national census. And so from that perspective, they have the expertise in terms of how to conduct the different surveys. So in essence, we are leveraging on their expertise, and it's the expertise that they are basically contributing to the demand survey exercises that we'll be conducting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. I don't know if Akata or Christine have an additional answer. I totally agree that the national statistics offices have the expertise and have the experience, and also have some other data that can complement or that can allow to, also in the formulation process of the demand side surveys. And I think we have a comment from Isabel from Senfri.
Yes, Luis, I'll read out Isabel's comment. I would be very interested to hear how members make those critical choices on what to include and exclude from their survey. So I believe this is a question for either Maria or Akata. Thank you.
I think I can have a take on answering the question. I think it is an issue of being guided by the national financial inclusion strategy of the country in terms of what aspects have been prioritized to be delivered across a horizon. So basically, there should be consensus between the various stakeholders in terms of what is critical to achieve in a specific demand survey. And of course, we are also looking at other complementary measures that we put in place, because it's not just through the demand survey that you can get answers to all your questions. For example, you can look at the supply side survey. You could also conduct a survey like we did in Zambia in 2017, when we're looking at the sex disaggregated aspect from the supply side survey, survey. So we designed a questionnaire which we administered to look at the quality of the financial services, and also we looked at the gender distribution in terms of management in the financial institution. So you can look at various ways and reach a compromise with the stakeholders. What you can't take in so as to avoid having a very long questionnaire, you can design other instruments through which those results can be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. I don't know if there's if Christine or Akata want to complement.
Hi, so
Louise, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. So for Fiji's case, deciding on what type of questions to include and what not to include, or the key focus areas, for us, it's a matter of prioritizing the thematic areas. So the last demand side survey was done in 2014-15. And so we're trying to conduct a second one. And because for us, resilience is a big thing, given the frequency of disasters. And so that's why we sort of wanted to fit in a specific questions on resilience. And because data is very limited, even from the supply side, the surveys that we usually piggyback on don't have this kind of questions that will help us provide more understanding on resilience. And so that's why we thought to include it in there. Some of the areas that we felt would have been better captured from the supply side, we decided to sort of drop them off. So that's how we come up with what to include in the survey questions and what not to include.
Thank you so much, Akata. One thing with that also reinforces the fact, no, given on having a clear focus and understanding what are the policy needs. And for instance, that also, brings us to right now the COVID-19 emergency that we're living. No? That also implies kind of resilience, right? I think it's a bit different from the climate, because this has a different nature and has I think it's a different, but and also I want to link this with the fact that you can use a different data sources, right, to complement and to address the policy needs. And for instance, and maybe this is a topic for the next webinar, but in the specific case of an emergency as of COVID-19, that in fact is an emergency, and you need some to collect some data in a kind of more urgent way. No, a demand side survey, a full-fledged demand side survey might not be the right answer, but there might be a complementary or additional data sources or data techniques to address and get the information needed to develop to make decisions, right? I wonder if there's any. I think we're now running out of time, and I really want first to appreciate our speakers for their interventions. If there is just one or two questions, we may allow for one or two questions, and then after that, I will allow each one of our speakers to make a key takeaway from this presentation or from the webinar. Mm-hmm. So,
Luis, I'll just read three, specifically since you mentioned COVID. There's a question from Rachel. From Rachel, it mentions, from Isaac, what questions can we include in the survey instrument to capture COVID-19 impacts on household outcome? So that is the first COVID-19 question. The next is from Rachel. Given the current COVID-19 pandemic, how do you intend to conduct the demand side surveys and ensure that you have covered the target audience? I think we leave it with those two for now, Luis. Thank you.
Thank you. I think they are very good questions. I will allow our speakers, some of our speakers, maybe Christine or Maria or Akata to respond.
Yes, so I can give a general observation, and then maybe Maria can or Akata can speak more specifically to their country experience. So I think the first question is what would you ask to gauge outcomes for people? And I think the important thing that even to remember that is that even for something like the pandemic, our lens is financial inclusion. So we want to understand how financial services are helping people to cope or not, and what the underlying financial needs are that are being triggered in the face of a crisis, and how people's maybe their informal networks break down when everybody faces a crisis or is in lockdown and cannot participate in the economy, and to then understand how people respond to face the resilience needs that arise. The second angle that you might want to explore in the wake of a crisis such as the COVID-19 is what is the impact of different policy changes that are being made to respond to the crisis. And here I think the work that we're doing in Rwanda is very relevant, where the government instituted a few rapid policy changes to help people to cope with the impact of the crisis. For example, by dropping fees on mobile money, or by instituting a few other strategies to facilitate the rapid digitization of payments in the economy. And there the question that would then be asked via your demand side survey techniques would be to understand how are people responding, to be able to evaluate whether the policy change has the desired effect. Now, as I mentioned before, maybe doing a fully fledged demand side survey that takes a long time to complete is not the most nimble or agile way to answer these questions, which you really want to assess almost real time or with a very quick response time. And that is then where I think the next webinar will touch on alternative techniques such as rapid SMS tracker surveys or telephonic interviews when there is a social distancing policy and you cannot go in the field to interview people. How can you make use of technologies of the mobile phone interface to really poll people on a quick and live basis? And also then how can you draw on data generated by your financial service providers, for example, data on digital transactions on mobile money and at which merchants people are transacting or what purpose they are transacting for, that you can all obtain from your supply side data sources. I hope that helps to answer.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christine. I think this answers this question and provides a little insights of our next webinar. And well, I don't know, Maria, if you want to provide your perspective. Sorry, I don't know why. Yeah.
I think she has adequately responded to the questions.
Okay. Akata, you want to provide, add something?
If I may just add, so we can have responding to the question on what type of questions do we ask to gauge impact of COVID-19 on household incomes. I think we can have top level questions on understanding coping strategies, but it's always important to also have smaller focus group discussions so that you can get more information out of the respondents and deep diving into what are their coping strategies, what they are coping with the situation, what What do they feel they should have done better? And what would they have preferred that government or financial institutions would have done to assist them given the current situation. So having small focus group discussions is also important to capture more in-depth information.
Excellent, thank you. Absolutely, I think, and also I think we'll go back to the first lesson shared by Christine and also by you with the case studies on how a clear focus on the policy needs, right? And the COVID-19, it's an emergency situation, but it has different stages. It's evolving because you have like a first stage when it's an emergency on health, and then it has been evolving also because it is becoming also a burden in the economy and in many many members of the society that are right now having they are not even able to cope with the incomes and with the livelihoods. So then you have other policy implementations and then you need to also many governments right now are trying to also measure this the policy response that they are doing, right? If they are going in the right direction. So and I think also this kind of methodologies on focus groups can provide this kind of granularity to understand how it's affecting or how it is how specific groups are coping with this situation, and also with receiving this the policies that have been implemented in different countries. So I want to thank you once again to these speakers. If you wanted to just provide just a 1 minute takeaway, and then we will wrap up, and we will invite you to the next webinar. Maybe we can start with Christine. If you want to say just one last takeaways.
Thank you, Luis. I think for me, the takeaway remains, and it's confirmed also by Maria and Akata's presentations, that there are some things that you want to track that are universal. You want to know the state of financial inclusion in your country, but then there are also context-specific things that are front of mind, either at a specific time, like if there's a specific crisis, or due to the nature of society. And that it is important to really be led by your local context and your local policy objectives to then say, what should I measure to inform decision makers that need to act to make this policy a reality? How can I measure, what are the key indicators to measure to track progress and ultimately help achieve outcomes for consumers?
Thank you so much, Christine. Maria, if you would like to add some last remark.
I think from the Zambian context, the gender aspect is quite critical and important. Another aspect is the low usage of financial services, which brings in the aspect of asking questions about financial health. Because that is a starting point for people to get engaged with financial services. So it's critical that as we devise our demand survey, we go to look at the pillars of financial health. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you. Akata, would you like to bring one final remark?
From Fiji's experience and on natural disasters and now the global pandemic, I think it is important, especially for our financial inclusion efforts, that we ensure that we are prepared, or we prepare our public to be able to better cope with any uncertainties that is to come. So having questions included in your demand side surveys, whether it be asking for natural disaster, be climate resilient, or any other crisis, it is important that we all prepare particularly the vulnerable, and assist them, make sure that financial inclusion is helping them to improve their livelihoods, as well as better prepare and protect themselves against this crisis.
Thank you so much, Akata. I think this is very useful, especially in this moment. And well, I want to thank Christine, I want to thank Maria, and I want to thank you, Akata, for sharing today your experiences on measuring financial inclusion through demand-side surveys, on what is the framework to establish and what are the challenges and what are the opportunities to establish this. And I think that this is the beauty of financial inclusion data working group, that we can have access and share different experiences and lessons. And well, from our end, I want to thank you also for participants, for our translators today. And I want to invite you to next week. We will issue the second part of this webinar. It will be on the May 21st, and we will send invitations shortly. We will also record this webinar for all of you if you want to revisit, and also for our colleagues that were not able to join. And well, thank you. Stay safe and stay at home and stay safe. And we wish you all the best from our side.